The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as much a part of a Midwestern summer as the buzz of cicadas in the oak trees. It was August of '73, hot enough to make the air shimmer above the parched farmyard of the old Miller place. The dust, fine as powdered sugar, coated everything. The pickups parked along the lane, the sweat-slicked faces of the farmers, and the rows of tired machinery lined up for their final judgment. I was standing near the back, leaning against the rusty fender of my Ford F-100, just watching. My name's Arthur Jensen. Most folks call me Art. I wasn't there to buy much, maybe a set of hay rakes if they went cheap. But mostly, I came to these things to keep a finger on the pulse of the county. You can learn a lot about your neighbors by what they're buying, what they're selling, and the look in their eyes when the bidding gets hot. That day, the only look that mattered was the one on Dale Bishop's face. He stood near the front, chest puffed out in a new pearl snap shirt, a wad of chewing tobacco bulging in his cheek. He hadn't been farming more than 5 years, but he acted like he'd invented the moldboard plough. He'd bought the old Henderson place last year, and now, with old man Miller gone, it was clear he intended to swallow this farm too. The auction for the land itself was next week, but Dale was already picking the bones clean, buying up the best of the equipment before anyone else had a chance. The prize of the day was Miller's International 10 Nancy 6. It wasn't brand new, but it was a clean, low-hour machine, with the black stripe decals and the big rubber to prove it. A real horse. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Clancy, worked the crowd into a lather. The bidding started strong, a few hopefuls trying to get in, but it quickly became a two-man race between a farmer from the next county and Dale. Dale was a spectacle. He never shouted a number. He'd just wait for the other fella to bid, let the silence hang for a second, and then give Clancy a short, sharp nod. It was a power play, a way of saying, "This is mine. You're just wasting everyone's time." The price climbed past what the tractor was worth, then past what anyone sane would pay for it. The other farmer finally shook his head and stepped back, wiping his brow with a red handkerchief. "Sold!" Clancy bellowed, pointing a thick finger at Dale. "To the man with the vision!" A smattering of polite applause broke out. Dale just spat a stream of brown juice into the dust and swaggered over to the tractor, slapping its fender like he was claiming a prize sow at the state fair. He saw me watching him, and a smirk spread across his face. He sauntered over, his new boots kicking up little puffs of dirt. "Just watching the show, Art?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Or you planning on buying something your old farm-all can't handle?" I just gave him a slow nod. "Afternoon, Dale. She's a nice-looking machine." "Nice-looking? She's a game-changer," he scoffed. "You can't make money in this business running antiques. The bank knows it. The co-op knows it. Seems like you're the only one who doesn't." He gestured vaguely at my 51 Farmall M, which I'd parked over by the county road. My father bought that tractor new, paid for it in cash after 3 good years in a row. It had turned every acre of my ground 100 times over. Its red paint was faded to a dull orange, and the seat was patched with duct tape, but the engine, that engine was the truest thing I knew. It started with 2 turns of the crank, even on the coldest winter morning. It didn't have power steering or a cab with a radio, but it also didn't have a payment book thick enough to choke a horse. "My M does the job," I said quietly. Dale laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Doing the job isn't good enough anymore, Art. This is the 70s. It's about efficiency. Gallons per acre, bushels per hour. I'll have this 80 disked before you can get your old relic started." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Abernathy down at the bank. He's handing out money like candy. Land prices are only going one way, up. You ought to get in on it. A man sitting on 200 acres, free and clear like you. You're sitting on a gold mine and using a shovel to dig it." I didn't say anything. I just looked past him at the rows of farmers. Some were nodding along with Dale, their faces a mixture of envy and admiration. Others, the older ones, watched with wary eyes. They'd seen booms before. They knew they were always followed by a bust. "Debt is a tool, Art," Dale finished, clapping me on the shoulder a little too hard. "You should try using it sometime. Might make a man out of you." He walked away then, heading back to his new prize, leaving me there with the dust and the heat and the low murmur of the crowd. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me. In that moment, I wasn't just Art Jensen, a farmer. I was a symbol, a living fossil, the man who refused to change, who clung to the old ways while the world roared past him. They thought I was a fool, too stubborn or too scared to take a chance. Before we go any further with this story, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Have you ever known a man like me, who stuck to his principles even when the whole world was telling him he was wrong? Maybe it was your father, or your grandfather, or a neighbor down the road. A man who believed that $1 earned was better than $2 borrowed. Let me know in the comments below, because it's important to remember that men like that existed. They're the reason some of us are still here. That winter, the talk at the grain elevator was all about Dale Bishop. He'd secured the loan for the Miller place, another 160 acres to his name. To work it, he'd traded in that 1066 he'd bought at the auction, plus a pile of the bank's money, for a brand new International 1466, the Turbo, they called it. It was a monster, the biggest two-wheel drive tractor the county had ever seen. It had duals on the back, a chrome stack that belched black smoke, and a sound that rattled the windows in the co-op office from a quarter-mile away. Dale would drive it into town for no reason at all, just to show it off. He'd park it right out front of the diner, its massive tires dwarfing the pickups and cars. He was living high on the hog. Corn was pushing $3 a bushel, beans even higher. The Russians were buying every kernel we could grow. The government was telling us to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. And the banks, led by men like Mr. Abernathy, were more than happy to finance the dream. It felt like the good times would never end. For me, that winter was a different story. It was a season of grease and cold steel. The Farmall M, my father's pride and joy, had finally shown its age. A plume of white smoke from the exhaust one cold November morning told me what I didn't want to know. Coolant was getting into the cylinders. A cracked head, or worse, a cracked block. Dale would have called the scrap man and had a new tractor delivered by noon. That wasn't my way. That tractor wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was my inheritance. It was 30 years of my family's sweat sealed in cast iron. I spent the better part of a week in the machine shed, a single trouble light hanging from a rafter, my breath pluming in the frigid air. The first job was to drain the fluids. The sweet, sickly smell of antifreeze filled the shed as it gurgled into a 5-gallon bucket. Then came the oil, black and thick, smelling of burnt hydrocarbons and honest work. I disconnected the fuel line, the radiator hoses, stiff and brittle with age, the throttle linkage, and the wiring to the magneto. Piece by piece, I stripped the tractor down. The hood came off first, then the heavy radiator. I used a chain hoist rigged to a ceiling beam to lift the cylinder head. It was a 2-man job, but my wife, Eleanor, was busy with the kids, so I did it myself, grunting and straining, walking the heavy iron assembly over to my workbench. There it was, plain as day, A hairline crack between the valve seats on number 3 cylinder. Not repairable. The next Saturday, I drove the F-100 80 miles to a salvage yard I knew, a sprawling graveyard of forgotten iron. I spent hours walking the muddy rows, past rusted-out combines and skeletal corn pickers, the wind whistling through their hollow frames. Finally I found it. A Farmel M, half swallowed by weeds, its tires rotted away, but its engine block looked intact. After an hour of wrestling with seized bolts and frozen nuts in the biting wind, I had the cylinder head free. The yard owner charged me $20 for it. Back in my shed, the real work began. I spent days cleaning that salvaged head, scraping off decades of caked-on grease and carbon. I used a wire brush on a drill until my arms ached. I lapped the valves by hand, using a suction cup tool and grinding compound, working each one back and forth, until it seated perfectly. The rhythmic, scraping sound was the only noise in the shed, a meditation in metal and patience. I checked the head for flatness with a straight edge and a feeler gauge, praying it wasn't warped. It was true. The reassembly was a careful, deliberate process. I laid the new head gasket in place, its copper rings gleaming in the dim light. I torqued the head bolts down in the proper sequence, following the pattern in the old iron tea shop manual my dad had kept. A little here, a little there, going around 3 times until the torque wrench clicked at the final spec. It was a slow dance of mechanics, a ritual I knew by heart. One afternoon, while I was elbow-deep in the engine, I heard the roar. It grew louder and louder until it was right outside my shed. I looked up and saw the grill of Dale Bishop's 1466 filling the open doorway. He was sitting high up in his heated cab, looking down at me like a king from his throne. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. He swung the cab door open. "Heard you were having some trouble, Art," he called out, a grin on his face. "Looks like I was right about that old museum piece. You want me to give you a tow to the scrapyard?" I wiped my greasy hands on a rag and walked to the doorway, squinting up at him in the bright winter sun. "Just some routine maintenance, Dale." "Routine maintenance?" He laughed. "Looks like you're performing surgery. You know, for what you're spending in time and busted knuckles, you could have made the down payment on a new 4030. Abernathy would have you approved in an hour." "I like to know my machinery, inside and out," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. That way, when something does go wrong, I don't have to call a dealer and wait 3 days for a mechanic who charges $30 an hour. Dale just shook his head, the grin never leaving his face. "Suit yourself. Some of us have more acres to worry about than we have time to play with wrenches. You keep playing with your toys. I'll be busy making money." He slammed the cab door, fired up the big turbo diesel with a belch of black smoke, and rumbled away, leaving the smell of unburnt fuel hanging in the cold air. I stood there for a long time, watching him go. He was right about one thing. I was spending a lot of time on it. Time I could have been using to repair fences or split firewood. The doubt, cold and sharp as the winter wind, pricked at me. Was I being wise, or just foolishly proud? Eleanor brought me out a hot thermos of coffee and a sandwich later that day. She stood there in her heavy coat, watching me work. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. I could see the worry in her eyes. "You'll get it, Art," she said softly, putting a hand on my arm. "You always do." Her faith was the fuel I needed. 2 days later, it was done. I filled the radiator with fresh antifreeze, the crankcase with new 30-weight oil. I opened the petcock on the carburetor to let the gas flow, then turned the ignition key. I walked to the front of the tractor and put my hand on the crank. I took a deep breath and gave it a sharp pull. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. It wasn't the screaming thunder of Dale's 1466. It was a lower, deeper sound, a steady, rhythmic popping that spoke of controlled power and reliability. I let it warm up, listening to the music of the valve train, checking for leaks. There were none. The exhaust was clean and clear. I climbed into the worn metal seat, the steel cold through my overalls, and a slow smile spread across my face. I had done it. I hadn't spent a dime I didn't have. I hadn't asked anyone for a thing. The old farmel was alive again, ready for another season. It was a small victory, one nobody else in the county would ever see or appreciate. But to me, it felt like winning a war. The mid-70s rolled in on a wave of prosperity. Grain prices stayed high, fueled by relentless foreign demand. Land that had sold for $500 an acre just a few years before was now fetching $1,500, then $2,000. It was a heady, intoxicating time. Farmers who had spent their lives pinching pennies were suddenly flush with cash, or at least with credit. The local John Deere and International Harvester dealerships couldn't keep new equipment on the lot. Four-wheel drive tractors, once a rarity seen only in magazines, started appearing in our corner of the world. Huge articulated beasts that could pull a 12-bottom plough and disc 100 acres in a day. Dale Bishop was at the forefront of the charge. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, all of it leveraged to the hilt. Every time a piece of land came up for sale, Dale was there, outbidding everyone, confident that rising values would cover his bets. He traded in the 14i6 for a new Steiger Panther, a lime-green monster that made his old tractor look like a garden toy. He bought a new Gleaner combine with an air-conditioned cab and a grain head so wide it had to be trailered down the highway. His farmstead, once a modest collection of buildings, was now dominated by massive new grain bins, their silver corrugated steel gleaming in the sun. He was the king of the county, the poster boy for the new era of agriculture. When he drove past my place, he didn't even bother to sneer anymore. He'd just give a pitying shake of his head as he saw me out in the field on my old Farmel M, or maybe on the John Deere 3020 I'd bought used, paid cash, to help with the planting. To him, and to most everyone else, I was a failure, a man who had been given a golden opportunity and had been too timid to seize it. The pressure to conform was immense. It came from all sides. My neighbors would corner me at the co-op. "Art, you've got to get bigger. You can't survive on 200 acres anymore." Even my brother-in-law, a salesman in the city, would lecture me at family dinners about return on equity and leveraging assets. The most direct pressure came from Mr. Abernathy at the Farmers and Merchants Bank. He was a man whose personality seemed to have been starched along with his white shirts. One afternoon in the fall of '78, his polished Buick pulled into my lane. I was greasing the corn picker, getting ready for harvest, my hands black with grime. He got out of his car, careful not to get any dust on his shiny wingtip shoes. "Arthur," he said, forgoing any pleasantries, "I was just looking over the county asset reports. Your operation stands out." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing, Mr. Abernathy?" I asked, wiping my hands on a rag. "It's an unusual thing," he replied, his eyes scanning my modest machine shed and the old but well-kept barn. "You're one of the very few farmers in this county with zero debt. Your land is paid for. Your operating notes are cleared by the end of each year. Commendable in its own way." "It's the way my father did it," I said. "It's the only way I know." "Your father," Abernathy said, a slight, dismissive smile touching his lips. farmed in a different era. The rules have changed. Inflation is running at nearly 10%. The money in your savings account is losing value every single day. The wise man, the modern man, borrows money and puts it into an asset that appreciates faster than inflation. And right now, that asset is land. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. The old McGregor farm, the 80 acres bordering your north fence line, is coming up for sale. The family is asking $2,000 an acre. I've taken the liberty of running the numbers. The bank would be happy to extend you a line of credit for the full purchase price, plus another $50,000 for a newer, larger tractor to work it. At current interest rates, your payments would be more than manageable with corn at $3.50 a bushel. He held the paper out to me. I didn't take it. I appreciate the thought, Mr. Abernathy, but I'm not looking to expand. Abernathy's smile faded. Arthur, I'm trying to help you. You're being left behind. Dale Bishop started with less than you, and he now controls 5 times the acreage. He's creating wealth. He's building an empire. You're just treading water. Dale Bishop owes your bank over $1 million, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I owe you nothing. I sleep pretty well at night. Does he? Abernathy's face hardened. He neatly folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. Pride is a poor substitute for profit, Arthur. There will come a day when you regret this conversation. The mantra for the next decade is simple. Get big or get out. The choice is yours. He turned and walked back to his Buick, leaving me standing there by the corn picker. His words echoed what I heard everywhere, what I read in the farm journals. They were all saying the same thing. I was a dinosaur. My way of thinking was obsolete. And I won't lie, there were nights I'd lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rustle the dry corn stalks outside the window. Eleanor would be sleeping soundly beside me, but my mind would be racing. Was Abernathy right? Was Dale the smart one? I watched him buy a new boat, take his family on a vacation to Florida. Meanwhile, our biggest luxury was going out for pizza once a month. I was saving every spare dollar, building a cash cushion. But for what? It felt like I was hoarding acorns while everyone else was feasting at a banquet. That harvest, I finished picking my corn in late October. It was a good crop, and the price was strong. I hauled my last load to the elevator, settled my account, and deposited the check. The farm was in the black for another year. My land was mine. My machines were mine. My time was my own. A week later, Dale was still struggling to get his crop out. A wet spell had turned his fields to mud. His massive Steiger tractor and his 12-row combine were too heavy. They just sank in the mire. He had to hire extra trucks, pay overtime. He was fighting the season, fighting the clock, fighting the monthly payment schedule that hung over his head like a storm cloud. I saw him one evening at the gas station, his face etched with fatigue, his eyes bloodshot. He looked years older than he had at the auction 5 years earlier. He was yelling at one of his hired hands about a broken hydraulic line on the combine. The king looked tired. His crown felt heavy. That night, as I was doing chores in the barn, the radio was on, tuned to the station out of Des Moines. The familiar drone of the farm market report finished, and the national news came on. The announcer's voice was grave. He spoke of unrest in the Middle East, of a revolution in a country called Iran. He mentioned oil prices, and something about the Federal Reserve chairman, a man named Paul Volcker, being determined to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. I didn't understand all the details, all the talk of monetary policy and global politics, but I understood the tone in the man's voice. It was the sound of a party ending. I paused, the scoop of feed for the cattle held forgotten in my hand, and listened as the announcer talked about interest rates. The word unprecedented was used. Outside, a cold wind rattled the barn door. The first snowflakes of the season were beginning to fall, swirling in the yellow glow of the yard light. The boom times had been loud, flashy, and full of promise, like a summer carnival. But now, I could hear a different sound on the wind. It was a low, distant rumble, the sound of a storm coming. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that very few people were prepared for the rain that was about to fall. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap. It was the opposite. It was a silence. The silence of a sky that refused to rain. The spring of 1980 arrived with a warm, dry wind that baked the moisture right out of the topsoil. We planted in dust, and we prayed for a storm that never came. By June, the young corn stood stunted and pale green, the leaves curling in on themselves by midday to conserve what little life they held. The soybeans were just as bad, their leaves a sickly yellow. It was a quiet, creeping disaster, unfolding day by day under a brassy, unforgiving sun. For me, the drought meant a smaller crop and less money. It was a hardship, but not a catastrophe. My costs were fixed and low. My biggest expense was fuel for the tractors, and with less ground to cover than my neighbors, I could manage. I had cash in the bank from the good years, a cushion my father had always called a rainy day fund, though he never imagined the worst trouble would come from a lack of rain. For Dale Bishop, the drought was a tightening noose. His operating loan for that year alone was more than my entire farm was worth. He had to pay for hundreds of acres worth of seed, fertilizer, and chemical, all bought on credit. He had 2 full-time hired men on his payroll, and he had the payments on his machinery, a monthly torrent of cash flowing out of his accounts and into the coffers of the bank and the equipment dealers. A bad crop wasn't a setback for him. It was a mortal wound. The pressure made him brittle. The easy confidence he once wore like a favorite coat was gone, replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. I'd see his Steiger running late into the night, its floodlights sweeping across the dry fields as he cultivated, trying to save every drop of moisture, burning fuel he couldn't afford to burn. Then his machinery, his symbols of progress and efficiency, began to betray him. One sweltering afternoon in July, I was mending fence along the line we shared when I saw the Steiger sitting dead silent in the middle of his field. A plume of blue-white smoke hung over it like a funeral shroud. I saw Dale climb down from the cab, throw his hat on the ground, and kick one of the massive tires with a fury that was startling to watch. I walked over, my wire pliers in my hand. "Trouble, Dale?" He spun around, his face slick with sweat and streaked with dirt. His eyes were wild. "Turbo's shot!" He spat, his voice hoarse. "Thing's only got 1,500 hours on it, and the damn turbo is shot. You know what that's gonna cost? 3,000 for the part, another 1,000 for the mechanic to drive out from the city to put it on. And I'll be down for a week, maybe more, waiting for it." "A week?" He kicked the tire again, a hollow thud of frustration. I looked at the enormous, complex engine. It was a maze of hoses, wires, and fuel lines I couldn't begin to comprehend. "Nothing you can do yourself?" I asked. He let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Do myself. Art, you need a computer to diagnose this thing. You need specialized metric wrenches I've never even seen. This isn't your little farm all. You can't fix this with a hammer and a prayer. I'm helpless, completely helpless." He was right. My old M was simple. Every part had a purpose I understood. I could tear it down to the frame and put it back together with the tools in my own shed. His Steiger was a marvel of engineering, but it was a black box. When it failed, he was no longer a farmer. He was just a customer, waiting by the phone, bleeding money with every hour that passed. That was just the beginning. During the fall harvest, the cracks in his empire began to show for all to see. The grain embargo Carter had slapped on the Soviets had sent corn prices tumbling. What little crop we had wasn't worth half what we'd expected. Dale, desperate for cash flow, had to sell his corn right out of the field, taking whatever miserable price the elevator offered. I, on the other hand, put my grain in my own cribs, paid for 30 years ago. I could afford to wait for the price to recover, even if it took a year. One day, I saw a cattle truck pulling out of Dale's lane. He was selling off his breeding stock, the herd his father had spent a lifetime building. It was a sign of desperation that every farmer in the county understood. You don't sell your foundation stock unless you are trying to stop a hemorrhage. The talk at the diner started to change. The whispers were no longer of Dale's success, but of his struggles. They spoke of how Mr. Abernathy from the bank was seen driving out to his place more and more often, his face looking grimmer each time. The king's castle was beginning to crumble. The winter of 1981 was when the storm finally broke. It wasn't a storm of snow or ice, but of numbers on paper. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their war against inflation, had driven the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21%. For years, Abernathy and the banks had been handing out variable rate loans like they were flyers for a church picnic. Now, those variable rates, once a tool for expansion, became instruments of execution. A loan that had been manageable at 8% became crippling at 15% and utterly impossible at 21%. It was a nationwide massacre. Stories started trickling in from neighboring counties of foreclosure sales. Good families, who had farmed the same ground for 100 years, were being put out on the road with nothing but what they could fit in their pickups. The phrase farm crisis started appearing in the newspapers. Around here, we didn't need to read about it. We were living it. Dale Bishop was caught in the very center of the storm. His $1 million debt was now accruing interest at a rate that was pure fantasy. He couldn't possibly earn it back, not with corn at $2 a bushel. The math simply didn't work. His empire wasn't just crumbling, it was imploding. The foreclosure notice was posted on the courthouse door in early March. A small, white piece of paper that undid a lifetime of work. The Dale Bishop Farm, all 960 acres, including the original homestead, the Miller Place, and the McGregor 80, was to be sold at public auction on the first Saturday in April. The day of the auction was cold and grey, with a raw wind that felt like it was coming straight off a glacier. It was the exact opposite of that hot, optimistic day at the Miller sale nearly a decade earlier. The crowd was different, too. There were no hopeful young farmers looking to expand. It was a somber gathering of neighbors, a few bargain-hunting investors from the city, and the ever-present bankers in their dark suits, their faces impassive. Dale was there, standing beside his wife. He looked like a stranger. The swagger was gone, the bravado completely stripped away. He was a thin, stooped man with hollows in his cheeks and the haunted eyes of a soldier who had seen too much. He looked 10 years older, his pearl snap shirts replaced by a worn work coat. He wasn't a king anymore. He was just a man watching his world be dismantled, piece by piece. The auctioneer, the same fast-talking Clancy, seemed subdued. His usual booming enthusiasm was replaced by a professional, almost funereal tone. He started with the small items: tools, livestock feeders, shop equipment. Things went for pennies on the dollar. Nobody had any money. Nobody felt right about picking over the bones of a neighbor's failed dream. Then came the machinery. The big Gleaner combine, which Dale had paid over $100,000 for, sold for $30,000 to a corporate farm from out of state. The fleet of tractors went next. Finally, they came to the Steiger Panther, the green monster that had been Dale's ultimate symbol of power. It sat there in the grey light, mud still caked on its tires, the ghost of a turbo failure still hanging over it. The bidding was sluggish. It finally sold for a quarter of its original price. With every slam of the gavel, I could see Dale flinch, as if he were taking a physical blow. I didn't bid on any of it. I didn't need it, and I couldn't stomach the thought of profiting from his ruin. I was just there to bear witness. While the machinery was being sold, I watched my own tractor, the Farm All M, which I had driven over and parked along the road. It sat there, small and unassuming, its faded paint a dull orange against the grey sky. It owed no one anything. It had weathered the drought, the price collapse, and the interest rate shock without complaint. It was proof that small and steady could outlast, big and fast. Finally, the land was put up for sale, parcel by parcel. The homestead went first, then the Miller place. The prices were heartbreaking. Land that would have brought $3,000 an acre just 2 years prior was now struggling to fetch $800. The bankers huddled together, their faces pale. Their collateral was evaporating before their eyes. Then Clancy announced the last parcel. "All right, folks, next up we have the McGregor 80. 80 acres, more or less, prime bottom ground, bordering the Jensen farm to the south." My heart gave a thump. This was the piece of land Abernathy had tried to push on me, the one he'd said would make a modern farmer out of me. I saw Abernathy himself standing near the front, looking miserable. This sale wasn't just Dale's failure, it was his too. He had pushed the loans, encouraged the debt. Now his bank was choking on it. "What am I bid, folks? Let's start it at $500 an acre," Clancy called out. Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the barn. 500. Do I hear 500? An investor from the city, a man in a clean trench coat, raised a finger. 500. I have 500. Now $600 an acre. I saw Dale's wife put a hand on his arm. This was it. The final piece. I thought about Dale's arrogance, his condescending laugh. I thought about how he'd called my tractor a museum piece. I could have felt a surge of triumph, of "I told you so," but I didn't. All I felt was a profound sadness for the waste of it all. Before I even knew I was going to do it, my own hand was in the air. 600, I said, my voice clear and steady. Clancy's eyes found me in the crowd. Abernathy turned and stared, his mouth slightly agape. The man in the trench coat looked irritated. "I have 600 from Art Jensen. Now 7. Do I hear 7? The man in the coat nodded. 7. 700, I said immediately, without hesitation. We went back and forth. 750. 850. The price was still a bargain, but it was more than the investors wanted to pay for the risk. The man in the coat conferred with his partner, then gave a slight shake of his head. "Sold!" Clancy yelled, his gavel cracking through the cold air. "For $850 an acre to Arthur Jensen." A murmur went through the crowd. I hadn't bought a piece of land in 20 years. I walked to the clerk's table, my legs feeling strangely light. I wrote a check, not against a line of credit, but against the cash I had patiently saved in the bank, the money from the good years, the money I hadn't spent on new paint and bigger iron. As I signed my name, I felt the weight of the moment. I hadn't just bought a field. I had proven a point, if only to myself. My father's way, the slow, cautious, debt-free way, had not only survived, it had prevailed. After the auction was over and the crowd began to disperse, I saw Dale standing alone by his empty machine shed, staring out at the fields that were no longer his. I walked over to him. He didn't look up as I approached. "I'm sorry for how things turned out, Dale," I said quietly. He gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "You were right, Art. All this time, you were right. I built a house of cards on borrowed money, and the first strong wind blew it all away." He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a weary clarity. You built your house out of stone. A small house, but it's still standing." "It's my father's house," I said. "I'm just the caretaker." We stood in silence for a moment, the wind whipping around us. "That McGregor 80, he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's good land. You'll do well with it." "I was thinking," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I'm getting older. I could use some help working it. I'd be willing to rent it to you, on shares. No cash up front. We just split the crop, whatever it turns out to be." He stared at me, his mouth open. He looked from me to the field and back again. For the first time that day, I saw a flicker of something other than despair in his eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the seed of it. He swallowed hard and nodded, unable to speak. I just clapped him on the shoulder, the way he had done to me all those years ago. But this time, it wasn't a gesture of dominance. It was a gesture of grace. The years that followed were lean, but they were manageable. The farm crisis scoured the countryside, leaving deep scars. For sale signs became a common sight along the county roads, but our farm held on. We lived simply. Eleanor planted a huge garden, canning and freezing enough to get us through the winters. I kept the old machinery running, using skills that were becoming rarer with each passing year. The 80 acres I'd bought from Dale's sale, worked by Dale himself on a sharecrop basis, helped us through the tightest spots. He was a changed man, humbled and hard-working, and in time we became something close to friends. The community's perspective shifted slowly, like a river changing its course. The men who had once slapped Dale on the back and called me an old fool now spoke in quieter tones at the co-op. They talked about debt-to-asset ratios instead of horsepower. My name was sometimes mentioned with a new kind of respect. I was no longer Art Jensen, the man who was afraid to take a chance. I was Art Jensen, the man who had survived. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The seasons turned. Our children grew up and moved away to build their own lives. But our son Michael always came back to help during planting and harvest. He loved the farm, but he saw the world differently, a blend of my caution and his generation's optimism. One crisp October afternoon, years later, I was out in the machine shed with Michael. We were giving the old Farm All M its annual tune-up before putting it away for the winter. I was an old man now, my hands stiff and knotted with arthritis, my movements slow. Michael, tall and strong, was doing most of the work while I supervised. He was adjusting the points in the magneto, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You know, Dad," he said, not looking up. "I was running the numbers. A new tractor, one of those compact utility models with a front-end loader. It would be so much more efficient. We could get a loan at a pretty decent rate." I smiled and leaned against the workbench. I reached out and patted the farmer's faded red hood, the metal worn smooth from decades of work and weather. "This tractor," I began, my voice a little raspy, "taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. It's not about efficiency or horsepower or keeping up with the neighbors. It's about what you truly own and what owns you." In the good times, Dale Bishop owned a fleet of brand new machines, but he never really owned them. The bank did. And when the hard times came, the bank took them back. But this old thing, your grandfather bought it and paid for it in a single season. I rebuilt its engine on my own workbench. We owe nothing on it. It will always be here. It doesn't matter if corn is $2 or $5. This tractor will start when we need it to, and it will never send us a bill in the mail. I picked up the old I&T shop manual, its pages soft and stained with the grease of 3 generations. The most valuable thing on this farm isn't the land or the crop in the bin. It's the knowledge of how to keep things running yourself. It's the freedom of not owing any man a single dime. That's your real inheritance, son. Don't you ever forget it. Michael stopped his work and looked at me, then at the old tractor. He nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He reached out and cranked the engine over. It sputtered once, then caught, settling into that same familiar, rhythmic pop, pop, pop that I had known my entire life. It was the sound of resilience, the sound of survival. It was the heartbeat of our farm, a steady, dependable rhythm, promising that no matter what storms came, we would still be here when the sun came out again.